My talk today is going to be on political representation and Liz Truss's speech and announcement that she's going to get rid of quotas and targets. So a bit of background. In December 2020, after 5 years of waiting for the 5 Women and Equality Committee inquiries to announce the outcome of a public consultation exercise on reforming the Gender Recognition Act, Liz Truss, MP, the current Minister for Women and International Trade, put some of the proposed reforms on gender ID to bed. In this highly polemicized speech, Liz Truss says that she wants to reject the approach taken by the left, captured as they are by identity politics and loud lobby groups, except of course for her plans to build 10 new gender identity clinics across the country to make it easier to get a GRC. But as we speak, the gender identitarian lobby, which has all the signs of a cult because they're authoritarian, communal and totalistic, aggressive in its proselytizing, systematic in its programs of indoctrination, relatively new, middle class in its clientele. It has an international vision with its misogynist remit, and they are busy working on oppression definitions to dilute language that refers to females of the species, nationally with the approval of states and internationally with the help of UN Women who have been captured by international development money to push the LGBTQI++, that's some kind of flat earth, everyone's equal policy fiction, by the NGOs captured by the porn and prostitution lobby, promoting the merger of gender identity into sex classification. Because panthers magically don't know someone's sex when paying to rape a woman, and it's women who are overwhelmingly trafficked. But let's forget about that with the flat earth policy. The intention is to confuse categories of oppression with multiple meanings. We have moved from trans women are trans women to trans women are women, and now trans women are females in proposed legislation in the US and Canada. CEDAW, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, is now being targeted after the institutional capture of UN women by the identitarian cult. Biden himself is now, and his lobby groups are proposing a reality czar to put together a cross-agency task force to tackle disinformation and domestic extremism. Data on everyone's habits and views will be held centrally in this new Ministry of Truth, and I hope Liz doesn't actually refer to that kind of data collection in her speech, where she wants to improve data collection and statistics. So in the preamble to her speech, Liz stated that dignity and humanity, not quotas and targets or equality of outcome, lead to fairness. Read that to mean dignity and humanity leads to fairness, not quotas and targets or equality of outcome. Liz seems to be against any kind of affirmative action to help in achieving fairness and for women to keep their dignity. Nice doublespeak. What she's really saying is that removing quotas, targets and outcomes for women is really better for her because she doesn't have to action the dormant sections in the Equality Act, such as Section 106, dormant since inception. It gives ministers the power to basically keep and publish data relating to the diversity of party candidates seeking selection, i.e. women. Before this new dignity and humanity comes along, Liz, women still have to put up with the dishonesty, histrionics, aggression, violence and arrogance of elected officials pursuing lobbyist agendas, deciding that women really want to be coerced into sexist gendered identities. But I'm sure Liz knows better. Liz, should women just simply include and ignore these loudmouth narcissists in parliamentary committees, party meetings, or even in the toilets, and be happy being unequal in this new proposed technological era of habit surveillance, where mixed-sex toilets are starting to resemble now brothels and voyeuristic pickup points for porn-addled men claiming a gender identity as the password? That's our public life now. What we need is an all departments, ministerial level, sustained campaign to undo the damage done to institutions across the United Kingdom and internationally to secure everybody's human rights, especially women's human rights, targeted by loud lobby groups to commit linguicide and other acts to politically, economically, socially, and geographically mainstream what is an oppressive ideology operating within now a shrinking labour market in the West. We need our political representation quotas and targets as our very dignity and humanity is being erased as women, Liz. Gender identitarianism is an assault on our existence and dignity as women and lesbians, as we are now faced with a terrible new freedom where nothing is true and everything is permitted, which is to say that everything is possible, including changing sex and sexuality to match gender and chest feeding. Well, as for the quotas, the Tories have always hated them, especially Blair's women's quotas, written in the Equality Act until 2030. But they never sought to action Section 106, obliging political parties to publish data relating to diversity of party candidates seeking selection. After all, I suppose, the government really doesn't want to end up sanctioning itself for its own failure to recruit more women in Parliament and more questions being asked by these women. Men in power don't want us in their divisive, ineffectual politics based on impossible principles with its rife clientelism, where there are exchanges of personal favours for political support. The UK political system is a clientelist system where the protection of one group leads to exclusion of another. The gender dimension ticks all the boxes in these systems where opportunities for electoral corruption are gendered in that only those with access to networks, those with connections within the local or national elite, those with resources to finance corrupt behaviour, and those who are already influential in society are in positions to be considered assets in these clientelist networks, and are usually the only ones to be trusted with the sensitive nature of the exchange, i.e. men. Okay, so let's look at the blocks of women's representation and any policies that failed to be implemented. In 2008, the EHRC Sex and Power publication stated that even if at the current rate of increase in the number of women elected to Parliament were to be maintained, it would take about 200 years and another 40 elections to achieve an equal number of women in Parliament. That's for 200 years. So an all-party parliamentary group was set up in 2010 for women in Parliament, and its aim was to make Parliament more representative of the country. The APPG endeavoured to reach out to women to encourage them into public life and look at ways to increase the number of women in Parliament. But it also acknowledged that quotas raise some questions and are not always a popular opinion. Quotas have always been targeted by all male-led political parties, and women's quotas are abused to allow males into women's reserved seats. We all know that. If women give up their quotas, then there is no need to action Section 106 to register data, record data on diversity of candidates up for selection, or to measure targets or outcomes. According to the APPG report, electoral gender quotas have been increasingly used and proved successful in providing a fast track to achieving greater gender balance on the international stage only. There is some pretense of cooperation of the EHRC with the recommendations set out in the UN Indicators for Sustainable Development Goal number 5.5, setting a domestic target of 45% representation of women in Parliament, because the UK lags miserably behind a lot of countries. In addition, the Women and Equalities Committee's report of 2016 to 17 recommended that the government should seek to introduce in legislation in this Parliament a statutory minimum proportion of female parliamentary candidates in general elections for each political party, while also ensuring that men did not become underrepresented. So the 45% would be acceptable, i.e. men would always want majority votes. It's not 50-50, it's 45% to 55%. But the Minister of Women, Liz, wants to get rid of quotas, stating that the government does not believe that the best way to achieve female representation is to maintain women's quotas. And they don't want to place any additional regulatory burden on political parties, including themselves. 12 years on, the problem of women in Parliament has not gone away, but it's not all due to quotas. The problem is with selections and how women are allowed to represent women in a democracy. Women are constrained by ideological and party groupthink, which is male-biased with no regulatory burden imposed. So why doesn't Liz just implement Section 106 of the Equality Act? Why doesn't the government bring forward legislative proposals to empower the Electoral Commission to collect and host this data to ensure consistency and transparency from political parties? Liz surely pointed to that in her speech, but she wants to get rid of quotas. So how does getting rid of quotas enhance her drive for dignity and humanity for all? Why has there been an ongoing inquiry into the Gender Recognition Act reforms? Is the Women's and Equality Committee now going to focus on women if we don't want women elected from quotas? Was the purpose of the first trans inquiry about was its purpose mainly about legally changing the definition of women to suit men in a democracy that functions in the interests of those who govern and their lobby groups? We agree, Liz, you shouldn't listen to them at all. Why has the government, since Maria Miller's trans inquiry in 2015, spent millions in grants to organisations with ridiculous views in order to astroturf us into the idea that one can change sex, be covered by the gender reassignment protected characteristic, and take political seats off women in addition to colonising our private spaces? Why is the increased political representation of women a threat? Well, I suppose as women grow in number and in legislative chambers, they will increasingly be able to form strategic coalitions to promote legislation related to women's issues, such as poverty, austerity, economic dependence, and sex-based violence, such as FGM. Men are concerned that a rise in the number of women may influence men's behaviour, causing both male and female legislators to pay more attention to women's issues. Or they are worried that it may provoke a backlash amongst the men who may employ a range of tactics to obstruct women's policy initiatives and keep them outside positions of power. The government's argument for removing quotas seems to be based on having a lower proportion of women who may be more effective than a higher number because female legislators may be able to specialise in women's concerns without appearing to undermine male domination. Well, of course. So we know all these institutions have a male bias, and all the practices are masculine, and they undermine, women in their ability to integrate women's concerns and perspectives into policy making. And I'm sure, but if we do reduce the intake by removing quotas, we will increase the predominance of this male bias, I'm sure, Liz. So since for women have been assigned an identity by men within a hierarchy of gender stereotypes, it's men who decide who equality works for, and that it can be downwardly negotiable now, where men can self-oppress and legally morph into any identity by erasing what makes women different to men in language, law, and everyday life. Because it's hard to erase facts like women and men are different and suffer in different ways, and based on that difference, sex matters. So what is it? What's the other problem to do with quotas? It's to do with party affiliation and ideology. It's been very important to men. Let's not pretend, Liz, that this ideology is removed or remote from the libertarian politics that destroyed the left in the 70s, which was just as romanticized and political with its partly drug-based hedonism, now we're faced with free hormones, and where its ideals of freedom were generally understood in sexual terms, although no one apart from those pesky feminists questioned the male-orientated terms of this ideology at the time. The left also romanticized the Cultural Revolution to overcome the division of mental from manual labor, like a bird now, flying in drag through the inner cities, a symbol of neo-capitalism in a neo-enlightenment painting. When questions like, what is equality, come up, either as a matter of law or equal ops, the left always interprets and reevaluates it in terms of sharing. That is, equality means sharing everything, especially men. They can share women's toilets, changing rooms, sports, prisons, and quotas set aside for women for political representation. But it's also a problem of the mechanisms and how candidates are selected within party disciplinary norms. They determine what kinds of women and men are elected, as well as the specific policy positions they are to adopt once they get into office. So you can't say things like, only women have a cervix, I assume. Selections are predominantly male determined. They vote, they have the voting power. And now more than ever, with women deserting political parties, well, they won't have enough women to even fill up a basic quota. So, you know, some may offer feminist policy concerns for men, including membership of women's caucuses and women's policy machines, caucuses and women's institutes, male policy officers, and we're seeing Lily Madigan's antics and Heather Peto's. But all feminists want is shared perspective among women as a group to justify calls for greater female political presence, as women and men differ in policy perspectives and preferences. You know, and then we have the arguments that gender is not a fixed identity that women and men bring with them when they enter into politics. But is one that is partially produced and reproduced within the context of legislature. What the thinker thinks, the prover does, I think, is the new philosophy. I just want to say that we should be actively researching and finding out what the government is proposing in bills and the rest of it, and try and use whatever networks we can. But we always have to bear in mind that wherever concessions we make in any deals that we make with government ministers, they have to take into account the ramifications of losing some aspects of our quotas and targets and the need for equality outcomes, because we're not the same, we are different. And that's what I really wanted to get across as a point, that we need to be vigilant and we need to look at everything that the government is producing and provide an opinion on it, and expect our organisations that have been set up since to filter it appropriately, but not change it dramatically.